If you have topics you would like to have us discuss on the Aging Well podcast, please click on the links in the episode description to send us a text or record your message or comments. We'd love to hear from you and how we can help you age well. If you benefit from the Aging Well podcast and would like to support the content financially, please click on the Support the Show link or support our affiliates and advertisers. Welcome to the Aging Well podcast. I'm Jeff Armstrong here with Corbin Bruton. In this and the episodes that follow, we will share candid discussions on aging and hear from the experts. We are here to inform and encourage as we experience, aging. In this episode, Corbin and I discuss the exercise continuum. More specifically, we discuss low-intensity, steady-state cardiorespiratory exercise and the differences between high-intensity interval training, or HIIT, and high-intensity interval resistance training versus high-intensity resistance training. We discuss the importance of distinguishing between these approaches and a role that specificity plays in exercising for performance and aging well.
So in previous podcasts, we talked about the different realms, I guess you could say, of cardio style training, anywhere between LISS, LISS, low intensity steady state, and then HIIT, high intensity interval training. Let's dive into that today and kind of discuss, what is a steady state style training?
Okay, yeah, I think today has been a good topic to kind of talk about that continuum between cardiorespiratory endurance exercise, muscle endurance, and muscle strength. And at the low end of that continuum, at the purely cardio, and I wouldn't even necessarily say purely cardiorespiratory endurance, because low intensity steady state exercise is right on the kind of the cusp of what we define as physical activity and what we define as exercise. Remember, exercise is a form of physical activity. Physical activity is anything that we do above and beyond kind of resting level of activity. So lying on a couch all day, your metabolism is still going to kind of keep your body alive and functioning. Once you get off the couch and start moving a little bit, that becomes physical activity. And so low intensity steady state exercise is, and again, I guess I got to go back to what is the definition of exercise. And exercise is basically physical activity that is performed for the purposes of improving one's appearance, improving performance, or improving one's health. And so it's a bit of a fine line. What are your goals and what you are doing? And that gray area is definitely found when we talk about low intensity, steady state exercise. I walk the dogs every day, or try to walk them every day. I walk them individually. So, I have neighbors. You have two dogs. Why do you walk them by themselves? They don't like to walk with each other. It's like, no, I increase my physical activity. I get twice as much activity by walking them separately. But to me, that's not exercise, because it's not for the purposes of improving my cardiorespiratory performance. You can maybe argue, well, by burning calories, you're helping to improve your body composition. But I do other things to kind of set that goal. And so for me, it's just really physical activity. And it's generally steady state. Both dogs, the small dog tends to walk a little faster than the big dog. So I might get a little bit more of a pace walking her first, but really it's about the same. And throughout the walk, with the exception of just there being hills and up and downs, it's generally at pretty much a steady state.
So would hiking fall in that category as well?
Generally would fall into that as well, because again, we tend to probably, when we're hiking, vary our speed of walking. So because the amount of oxygen your body is consuming is going to depend on both the inclination, the vertical component of the hiking or walking, as well as the horizontal component. And so when we're walking up a steep hill, we're going to tend to walk slower than we would on the level ground or on a downhill. And so we may be basically expending the same amount of energy throughout the hike, but we're doing it at different rates and different changes in elevation and so on. And so that generally would be considered a low intensity steady state. If you take it more aggressively, you might consider that to be more of a moderate intensity steady state. If you're like all out racing up the hill and, make doing the hike as quickly as possible, and there are, competitors that do, more like race type hiking or, kind of trail races and things like that where they're actually running, that would be more of a high intensity steady state. And so really when we're talking steady state, it's just we're not varying the pace. And so when you look at somebody who is kind of out walking on the weekends, many of them think they're doing it for exercise. I sometimes argue, you really depends on the intensity that you're really doing. And low intensity steady state exercise generally is not quite sufficient enough to dramatically increase one's oxygen consumption or their VO2 max. And that's because we're not really affecting stroke volume max, and we're really not depriving the muscles of oxygen to the extent that we are going to stimulate more mitochondria, more capillarization in the muscle, things that are going to affect what we refer to as arteriovenous oxygen difference in exercise physiology, which hopefully you recall. And so those two major components of what contribute to one's oxygen consumption are not really dramatically affected. Now, we can burn calories because we're moving more than we are at rest. Unfortunately, you're burning those calories at a much lower rate. So if you're trying to burn a significant number of calories, you have to do low intensity steady state for a much, much longer period of time. Now, if you are a marathon runner and you're training for a marathon, you may do, what they often kind of refer to as their long run. It might just be all for distance, not so much a high intensity. So low to moderate intensity, steady state, just really building up the distance. That's going to have some benefit in terms of performance. So it is exercise, but it's not really intended to improve cardiorespiratory endurance as much. So I don't know if I've kind of.
So it's kind of like maintaining that steady state without using up as much energy as possible to see how far you can go.
It's generally just moving at a relatively steady state for a prolonged period of time. And, if we can get out and be active, we should be doing a lot more low intensity, steady state exercise. You don't have to do low intensity, steady state exercise. You don't necessarily have to go out and, buy running shoes and performance clothing and things like that. You can generally walk in your street clothes and get that. My wife was just up in Seattle for business, and she was talking about how much she was, walking up there. And she tries when she's in a city like that where she can walk a lot more. She does a lot more walking from meeting to meeting and gets a lot more of that low intensity, steady state type of activity. So
now, what could be low intensity for you and me for that aging population? That could what we would consider low intensity. Would they consider that to possibly be high intensity depending on their mobility at that point? Now, ideally, we want them to age well to where no matter what movement they're doing, they're able to have that functionality. But if they're kind of struggling with their movements, just getting up and walking and moving could be a challenge. Would that fall in that category of high intensity for them?
Well, the thing to remember is intensity is relative. So, we always base intensity on the VO2 max, the maximal oxygen consumption. Now, you don't have to go out and measure that. I mean, it can be pretty much just done on perception. What is your all-out effort? What's the most amount of work you can do? Then it's relative to that. And so for me, I can walk a pretty brisk pace. It helps that I'm 6'5", but I'm also fairly fit. So for me to go out and kind of walk at like a 5 mile an hour pace, it's not that significant. But somebody of shorter stature or who is maybe less fit, it may be a lot more difficult for them to maintain that pace. I used to work with a woman who was much shorter than me, and she would run on a treadmill next to me at work. at the same speed I'm walking, and she would like, move to another treadmill. You're embarrassing me. It's like, well, your legs are so short. Yeah, they got to move faster. So it's a run for you at that pace. But, for me, it's just striding out walking.
It's just a leisurely stroll.
Yeah. And so for the elderly, it could be much, much slower. It might be a 3 minute, 3 mile an hour pace that is a little bit, it's more than, a casual pace for them. It's getting their breathing up a little bit, but that is their low intensity steady state. For me, it might be 5 miles an hour. So it's going to be different for everybody. And so when we're looking at intensity of exercise, we can't compare ourselves to someone else. We have to kind of compare our intensity to our own personal maximum. So when we talk about these different aspects of cardiorespiratory endurance training as we move across the continuum, we have to remember that it is relative intensity, not compared to somebody else.
And I think there's a real maturity in that, right? Because a lot of people, they have it in their head like, oh, I should be doing this. It shouldn't be this difficult. But no matter where you're at in your journey, you have a specific starting point. And the whole goal, especially of this podcast, is to get everyone to age well, is to get everyone to focus on their goals, not you're focusing on your neighbor's goals and you should be trying to keep up with them. Ideally, if that is one of your goals, great. Focus on that. Have your training around that. But your intensity is going to be custom for you. Eventually, you want to advance that intensity because that's how we also grow. So
Well, before we do it too, I want to mention one other thing that kind of governs our intensity during exercise, and that is our health and comorbidities. For many people who, maybe have heart disease or something like that, prescribed too high of an intensity may actually trigger certain cardiovascular events that could be detrimental to your life and your health. And so whenever anybody is starting out in any kind of exercise program, of course, especially with our aging population, you want to have that doctor's examination and approval. For many people, it might require a stress test to determine what would be an appropriate intensity level, but you want the intensity to be enough to stimulate performance improvements without putting your health and your life at risk. So let's go on.
Well, let's transition from that low intensity steady state into that high interval training, that HIIT training.
I discussed my epigenetics test with True Diagnostic co-founder Hannah Wendt in episode 162. Epigenetic testing measures baseline and changes in your pace of aging, giving you the power to steer your anti-aging or health and wellness journey in the right direction. I learned that I am aging well. Click on the affiliate link in the episode description, use the promo code AGEWELL, and receive a 12% discount on your epigenetics test and monitor your pace of aging. Okay. So first question is, why do we want to transition from steady state to interval training? And let's kind of define, before we even get into high intensity, because you can do low intensity interval training.
That's true.
So you have that person who's been doing a lot of low intensity steady state. They're rather unfit, but they want to get a little bit more out of their workout in a little bit shorter period of time. They might start ramping up their intensity a little bit, but they can't do that for prolonged periods of time. And so intensity, or rather interval training, is where we are varying the intensity of our exercise over time. And it's generally considered to be fixed intervals. So you might say, do 30 seconds of a more high intensity bout. So I'm out walking for exercise and I'm going to take 30 seconds and just walk more briskly, and then go 3 minutes where I slow my pace down a little bit, allow myself to recover, get my heart rate back down, and then they do another burst. And so, or you do it on a stationary cycle ergometer, a bike, call them bikes, but they're not really bikes because they only have one wheel. So a stationary bike at home, you might, pedal faster for 30 seconds and then back off for a period of time to allow your body to recover. That's interval training. And interval training is just simply fixed intervals of high versus low or moderate intensities of exercise. And you can have varying levels of intensity within those intervals too. So the one thing I like about interval training is it makes training much more interesting. I don't like steady state because it's like if I get on a bike and just pedal, unless I got a TV on in front of me or my iPad or something with some Netflix on, and I can, just kind of get into a certain pedaling rhythm and just do that for a long period of time to simply just kind of burn calories. I'm not really focused on improving my cardiorespiratory fitness per se. But in most cases, I like to kind of vary things up a little bit in order to kind of work the cardiovascular system a little bit more effectively. And so interval training can do that. And might just, okay, I'm going to go 2 minutes at this intensity, 1 minute at this intensity, 30 seconds at this intensity. And then I have it all prescribed so that I'm varying those across the, say, 30-minute workout. What's nice about the interval training is that the cumulative amount of calories burned and load that you've put on the cardiorespiratory system is much greater in a shorter period of time. And so, if you're trying to burn calories, the 500 kilocalorie rule applies, right? That, roughly 100 kilocalories are burned whether you're walking, jogging, or running. So if I can walk part of that, jog part of that, and or run part of that, then the more time I spend running, the more calories I'm burning in a shorter period of time. And so I can actually decrease the duration of my cardiorespiratory exercise and have more time for other things. Whereas with long, slow distances or low intensity, steady state exercise, I have to do that for a much longer period of time to accomplish the same caloric expenditure. So interval training is just simply those fixed changes in the intensity of the exercise. Now, when we talk about interval training, then we can talk about low intensity, where again, now we're just varying within a low range of intensities, or moderate intensity, where those intervals bump up a little bit, but they're not really hugely strenuous. And then high intensity is where we have generally shorter bouts that are at a much higher intensity, and then we drop down to a lower intensity to recover. And so that's what's considered high intensity interval training. And that can run a gamut of different ways to prescribe that. We'll talk probably here shortly, I'm sure, about Tabata, what is Tabata and what is not Tabata. But any types of high intensity interval training that you tend to favor?
So when I was teaching classes, there were different styles of interval training that I would do. So if I was teaching, say, a circuit class, we just had people kind of rotate through a just different series of exercises, whether it was resistance training, like performing a squat, or we would throw in some plyometrics in there. They were performing the exercise for 60 seconds and then taking a 30-second rest to recover. Now, that wasn't as intense as my other HIIT, which I guess would fall in the category of a HIIRT training because there was a little bit more resistance there. But the intensity was a lot more advanced, and we would go 40 seconds on, 20 seconds on for a rest. And then the most probably advanced, really, really killing yourself course that I taught was like a tread and shed, and we'd increase the incline on a treadmill to maximum capacity. And then people were running. We were either going 20 seconds or 30 seconds, depending on what they were doing. And then we were giving them a full 60 seconds to fully recover, lower that heart rate down. And then they were hopping back on and going all out as hard as they could. Boom, taking that time off. So,
okay. So what you've brought up there is I think an important distinction. And you kind of mentioned HIIT versus HIIRT.
Correct.
Those first exercises you were talking about, where we're doing more body weight, resistance-based type of activities, I classify those much more as HIIRT, or high intensity interval resistance training, as opposed to high intensity interval training. And I think there should be a distinction there. And the reason being is that we move in that continuum the nature of the activity that we're doing and how we're doing it is going to impact the physiological systems that we are affecting. And remember, the principle of specificity always applies. The body makes specific adaptations to impose demands. And so when I talk HIIT, or high intensity interval training, or just sometimes that's just HIIT, sometimes it's two I's in it. It doesn't matter. It's still the same thing. That tends to be more cardiovascular driven. So the activities that I would do for high intensity interval training would be walking, running, jump rope, bike. You could do swimming, stair stepping, Versa climber, all those types of things that are stressing more the heart than simply the muscle endurance. And so they tend to favor a little bit more improvements in stroke volume max, but definitely the AVO2 difference max. Those two components that we can effectively improve our VO2 max. Now we move into high intensity interval resistance training, and important now 2 I's versus 1 eye, because we'll talk here in a moment about HIIRT with just 1 eye. High intensity interval resistance training is often kind of labeled in gyms as Tabata, and that bothers me. And we'll talk here shortly about kind of what is real Tabata. And I just tend to use little air quotes around that, or if I write it out, I use quotation marks, because the original Tabata study is more of a high intensity interval training, not resistance training. But high intensity interval resistance training, sometimes it's referred to as blast training or burst training, or other good terminologies for it, is where we are doing some generally compound movement that involves large muscles of the body in repetitive contractions for as many reps as possible in a duration of time. Now, those are good for muscle endurance, for improving body composition. The amount that it begins to affect the cardiorespiratory endurance system is a little bit more questionable, and I think it really depends on the individual, the activity. The studies that have been done on circuit training for cardiorespiratory health have been a bit equivocal over the years, I think. And so I tend to favor those for people who are looking at really just improving body composition, trying to affect the musculature a little bit. You're not going to see hypertrophy doing it. You're going to see what appears to be hypertrophy because you burn body fat, and so the muscle peeks out of the fat a little bit more, so you look like you're a bit more muscular, more toned. You're not going to see quite as much, definitely not going to see improvements in stroke volume max. You might see a little bit more effect on the AVO2 difference because the muscles are being deprived of oxygen. They're going to tend to favor increasing capillarization, increasing the number of mitochondria in the muscle. So it can have a slight benefit for improving cardiorespiratory endurance. But the downside of doing those, particularly when we're looking at trying to maximize the performance in order to stress the cardiovascular system, is that because these are compound movements, they are very technically oriented, and technique needs to be maintained to protect against injury. And so doing an activity for multiple repetitions to the point of almost fatigue, you start to see technique begin to fall apart. There's a greater risk of injury. And so we have to be very, very careful in doing high intensity interval resistance training that we maintain proper technique throughout the activity that we're doing. And so that kind of brings me to Tabata. You're familiar, of course, with Tabata, and the Japanese researchers that kind of came up with, I think it was Azumi Tabata and colleagues. And I want to say it was like 1998 that the study was done. It might be a little bit off on the years there, but they looked at training individuals at really ultra high intensities for a short period of time and whether that would impact the VO2 max. And what they found was comparing to more of a steady state cardiovascular exercise performed on a bike 5 times per week to what they referred to as the IE1 protocol, which was intervals on a stationary leg ergometer that were at ultra high intensity. They were about 100, I think it was 170, 175% of VO2 max. Very, very high intensity for 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, and you did a cycle of 8 of those. So it was like really 4 minutes of cardiorespiratory exercise, warm up and cool down. It probably amounted to less than about 12 minutes of cardio. And what they found was over the period of the training, they actually improved VO2 max in both scenarios, but VO2 max was slightly greater, more greatly improved in the IE1 protocol. And so that essentially tells us that really high intensity interval training can have a very positive effect on our VO2 max with very limited time commitment. The challenge is that that intensity was so high, and the study was performed on Olympic level speed skaters. And there were individuals who could not complete the protocol and were dropped from the study. So that basically tells you have an elite athlete cannot perform this protocol. Good chance that Joe the plumber going to the gym and doing a Tabata workout is probably not going to be hitting that intensity. And so when we take Tabata and label high intensity interval resistance training as Tabata, I got to put the quotation marks around that. And even when I do high intensity interval training in a Tabata format, and I like doing it because, again, it's very condensed. I can get a better workout in a shorter period of time. I know I'm not likely hitting that high of an intensity, but I'm going out as all out as I can for 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. Then I'll consider that quotation mark Tabata. But when we're doing it as high intensity interval resistance training, I think it's not as ideal to label it as such, because imagine trying to do burpees at 175% of your VO2 max.
Nope.
You're going to hurt yourself. There's just no way the exercises that are generally performed in those types of workouts can be done at that level of intensity. Now, you're going as all out as you can, doing those in proper form as high intensity as you can. That's great. And it could be the 20-minute or 20-second interval, 10-second rest. I do, and I think I've mentioned in previous
8
podcasts
times on that. Like,
yeah.
that's.
I like to do what I call Tabata, again with air quotes around it, planks, where I do 20-second plank, 10-second rest, and you repeat that 8 times. Those can be pretty strenuous. I use them with the wrestlers that I've been working with. They love those because they're hard. But any activity that we can do, we could take that 20-second on, 10-second off, as many repetitions as possible, or sustaining the effort for that period of time. And it's going to have benefit. And so I'm not poo-pooing any kind of training that labels itself as Tabata, but I just want people to realize that that is not going to have the same effect on the cardiovascular system as the IE1 protocol. And so it moves us a little bit further along that continuum towards muscle endurance. Whatever you call it, rose by any other name still smells the same, right? So it doesn't, we can get nitpicky in terms of what do we label these exercises, and what is more effective than another, is 30 seconds and 10 seconds off going to be more effective? It really doesn't matter. It's the cumulative activity that we are doing that's going to have the most benefit. But if we're doing those bodyweight type of exercises, a couple key points to consider is, one, we got to be doing them in a proper technique throughout. So maintaining proper technique. And if we're doing as many repetitions as possible, again, it's technique and performance that's more important than the number of repetitions. You get sloppy, they're no longer good repetitions. And so high intensity interval resistance training, I think, is pretty good, but consider, what are we doing it for? Are we doing it for cardiovascular health? You're probably getting too far to the right of the continuum now to consider that as beneficial for cardiorespiratory endurance.
So it almost seems that before you go into that high intensity interval resistance training, you should probably do a low intensity resistance training just to get the form, get the technique, get that mind-body connection. So when fatigue does start to set in, you're not pushing yourself to the point where you're exposing yourself to a higher risk of injuries. it seems to me that by starting off with that lower level of intensity and building that strength, building the, I guess, mind muscle connection, or just being fully aware and fully in tune of what you're capable of, and saying, yep, I got good technique right here. Eventually, when you get to that more advanced level and fatigue does start setting in, it's a good time for you to say, okay, I got to back off, or I got to lower the weight or the resistance because I'm placing myself at a higher risk of injury. Is that safe to say?
And again, when we start kind of getting into resistance training, intensity can become a little bit more muddied. I mean, high intensity interval resistance training, we're not really looking at intensity from the standpoint of percentage of your one repetition maximum. We're really looking at it just being more intensely muscle endurance form. So you can do, if anybody at any level can go into a class that is doing some kind of, muscle blast, whatever you want to call it, Tabata with quotation marks or without type of workout, do the same movement patterns as somebody else, but they're probably not going to do as many repetitions in that proper form. Or if they're doing them weighted, they're not going to have as much weight on that activity. So somebody starting out might do just the movement without any weight, whereas somebody who has been doing it for a while might be able to do, say, squats with reasonably weighted barbell for, 20 seconds of repetitions or 30 seconds of repetitions, take their 10-second rest, and then load up again and then do it. So the intensity, again, is always relative. So it may be more or less high intensity for that unfit individual, but it's also high intensity for the fit individual. And, so when we start talking in terms of intensity with strength, we're starting to look at percentage of VO2 max, high intensity, as many repetitions as possible type of activities is technically going to be done at a much lower intensity of resistance, but it needs to be comparable to what would be the appropriate intensity for that individual for that activity. And so, if you're doing burpees you really can't do weighted. I mean, some people will do them maybe with a weighted vest if you get really, really good at them. But again, the technique needs to be there. And what's the point in, getting 2 weighted burpees done in, a 30-second burst when you can do, 10 burpees unweighted in that same period of time, which gives you the greater benefit. And so, you have to kind of weigh what is most optimal for what you're trying to do. If you're getting into an excessive number of repetitions or form is starting to break down because you're trying to do the repetitions too fast because they're just too easy, then maybe you weight the exercise. So high intensity interval resistance training gets a little bit tricky. And then we can get into what's considered high intensity resistance training. And that is really just kind of doing your weighted exercise to a point of fatigue, and only really doing like one set with minimal amount of rest in between. And there's a lot of different variations within that. That itself might be another podcast to kind of tackle. But so we've kind of run this continuum as we start getting heavier in the weight.
That should be another podcast, because there is a famous bodybuilder, Dorian Yates, and he actually really, really lived by that. But what level of fatigue? Because what you and I would talk about fatigue, let's just talk about the bench press. We would say the fatigue got to the point where, you can't even push it up. He would say, yeah, you fatigue with that push, but as you're resisting it going down, you're a lot more stronger. And he wanted to push it to the point where he couldn't even resist it going down. And I feel like that's a completely different realm of level of fatigue altogether.
You love opening these cans of worms.
Yeah, well,
at the end of a podcast. We definitely need to do kind of a separate podcast on the resistance training aspect and intensity and the different variations of that. I was weaned on Nautilus training back in the early days of Art Jones and Nautilus, and Mike Metzger. It's probably more so than Dorian Yates linked to high intensity training. one set to failure, just blasting. And there's all different techniques that you can use to really just exhaust the muscle. I remember one time some buddies and I used to go to Steel City Nautilus in Pittsburgh and work out. And we decided to bike there one day from our community, which was, I forget how far of a bike ride it was. It was probably at least about an 8 to 10 mile bike ride. And, great, good cardiovascular workout. But what we didn't realize is we got to bike home after doing this leg workout. And, you're all wobbly on our 10 speeds, kind of traveling down, I think it was Route 51 in Pittsburgh to kind of get home from the gym. And it was not the safest ride home. And so, we'll talk about high intensity resistance training here in a future podcast. But what are the thoughts on high intensity interval resistance training?
I like it. I know it's actually becoming a lot more popular, especially with these hybrid training that's out there, and there's a lot of literature on.
Talk about hybrid training, because when I talk hybrid training, I kind of probably get to a little bit different. I get to more of an Alex Viada definition of hybrid training or the hybrid athlete. What are you talking about with hybrid training?
So the hybrid, especially right now, it's kind of like with the current literature that's out there, and this increase of like everyone wants to do it. It's kind of like a hybrid between marathon running and then bodybuilding at the same time, just kind of getting in the whole realm of athletics across the board. Some people would say, yeah, CrossFitting has done it.
Okay, well,
but it's more like,
so you got kind of two ends of the spectrum there.
You do have way two ends of the spectrum.
You talk about hybrid training within CrossFit. I think you're really kind of really hitting it on the head with the high intensity interval resistance training, where you are really on that cusp of cardiorespiratory versus muscle endurance training, and really kind of teetering on either side of that. And in that type of training, because again, the principle of specificity, you're going to get specific adaptations to impose demands. And so if we are training a true balance between cardiorespiratory and muscle endurance training, we're not building strength at all, because we are so far away from strength performance. We're not going to see that. And so we're really focused much more on body composition and just a slight improvement in your cardiorespiratory endurance. And part of that is because the way they train in CrossFit is that they're doing a little bit more, some specific activity for cardiorespiratory endurance. They're not just simply doing a high intensity interval resistance training only to improve both of those capacities.
I don't know, man. Those elite athletes, those elite ones that make it to the CrossFit Games.
Elite CrossFit athletes are not doing what the average. They're not doing what the average CrossFit athlete is doing. Right. They're doing a strength component. They're doing really a more pure hybrid type of training. In fact, in Alex Viada's book, he actually, one of the training programs that he details in there is for CrossFit. And I think it's like marathon running or some other component. But true hybrid training, if we allow Alex Viada the credit for labeling the hybrid athlete or hybrid training, is where we are taking these diverse components of performance and training them more or less simultaneously to improve performance in both of those. And so you'd be looking at a power lifter running a marathon. And Alex Viada is, at least at one point, I think he was able to run like a sub 5 minute mile and squat. I think it was like 700 pounds or something like that. I mean, and you see pictures of the guy. I mean, he looks like a bodybuilder, but you'll see him riding a bike, doing triathlons or ultra distance racing and things like that. That's a whole nother topic in terms of how do we optimize performance in multi dimensions of physical performance. Because we talk about the health-related components of physical fitness. We have cardiorespiratory, muscle endurance, muscle strength, body composition, and flexibility. So, we're looking at, being the optimal strength athlete and the optimal endurance athlete. Can you do that? And there are ways to train for that. But one thing to consider is, again, with the principle of specificity, and the need for recoverability. An individual who is training intensely in one component does not have as much of the energy necessary to improve to the same effect in another dimension of health or performance. And so when we train as a more hybrid approach, we're giving up a little bit on both ends of that spectrum. And that warrants a little bit of kind of further consideration. But there are things that we can do in our training. I favor kind of the compartmentalization of the training in order to optimize improvements in both of those. When we talk in terms of hybrid within the session itself, the more we hybridize the training within a session, the less specific adaptation we're going to get from that training. And so we can touch on that a little bit more because that's definitely beyond kind of where we're at today. So any other thoughts kind of on HIIT or HIIRT? What have we not covered?
Well, the only thing I can really think of is we've mentioned marathon running. We've mentioned HIIT training. I know that when I don't know why I took this course, but at some time when I was doing personal training, I was trying to get some extra credit to keep my certificate going. And I ended up taking a course on marathon training, and we went into the subject of fartlek, right? And
yes, we have not talked about fartlek.
We have not talked about fartlek. And fartlek translates to plays with speed. I learned that in that.
Finish. Yeah. Finish for speed play. Yeah.
Oh, yes. And speed play. Yep.
Yeah. So fartlek training, and if you're going to look that up, it is FARTLEK is how it's spelled, but the T is silent, and thankfully for obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. But fartlek training can be confused with interval training, but the distinction is that, we're talking speed play. So it is much less regularized. Is that a word? Regular than interval training would be. And so that will involve bursts of high intensity followed by kind of a self-perceived necessity for recovery. And then you do another burst. And that's very effective for marathon training because you're going to end up having to kind of kick into some of the other energy systems to pass somebody or to kind of maintain your speed up a hill, and then you got to kind of recover a little bit. So fartlek training has a lot of good applications. There's a lot of good ways to do that. I like doing it with athletes or anybody that I'm conditioning. One popular way to do it is where you might line up all of the athletes in a group. You kind of want them in a group where they're moderately, closely in about the same fitness level. So you have, say, maybe 10 athletes lined up, and the person from the rear, as they're jogging, or, running at a lower intensity, the back person sprints to the front of the line and then kind of recovers back into a more general pace, and then the back person runs. Those are really good. I learned teaching a cross-country class a number of years ago. I ran it with my students, and what I found that they would do is when I got to the back, they would spread themselves out. So I had a further distance to have to sprint, and then they'd bunch themselves up a little bit more when they were having to do their sprints. And so I caught on to that pretty quickly, but there wasn't much I can do about it. They were still going to do it if I was running with them. The other way that you could do fartleks is I like to use like a whistle as a coach to just, one whistle would be a jog, 2 whistles would be a kind of double time, 3 whistles would be a sprint, and then 4 whistles was supposed to be a walk. I never actually kind of gave the walk, but I use those whistles based on the energy systems. And so 3 whistles, that all-out effort is intended to kind of tap into the ATP-PC system, your high intensity, the energy that's stored in the muscle, very fast fatiguing. Do that for maybe 15 seconds, maybe push that a little bit longer just to kind of stress or stretch that level of the energy system a bit more. 30 seconds for more moderate pace, kind of getting the lactic acid system, the glycolytic energy system. And then the one whistle would be for more of just a slower pace, a recovery pace. If necessary, I might have them walk a little bit, but you'd vary that up a little bit, try and push the times. You might give them a little bit more recovery if you know that they seem a bit more fatigued from the previous burst, or you might stretch those bursts a little bit longer so they're a little less regular, and I would classify that as fartlek. But the main difference really is that you are doing some type of tempo changes in your training in order to tap into the multiple energy systems that provide us with the fuel for muscle contraction, and they are much less regular than an interval type of training.
So all in all, for the population that is listening to our podcast and they're trying to get a message to take home in order to age well, what is the take home message with these different styles of training?
Well, I think, all of them have benefit. You need to evaluate what are your goals, first off. What's your capacity? What are the health risks involved with doing these types of activities? Not everybody can do high intensity interval training because it might put them at a greater risk of, a cardiovascular event or a cerebral vascular event. And so, they might need to be a little bit more careful. So pick what is suiting your goals. Consider the time you have available to exercise. So we want to optimize time as much as possible. So if we can get the job done in a shorter period of time, it's going to be much more beneficial than taking a much, much longer period of time. When it comes to low intensity, steady state exercise, try and get as much of that as possible. So move as often as possible, increase your physical activity as well as your exercise. The high intensity interval stuff, remember, it's going to take a little bit more in time to recover from that. That should complement our strengthening exercises, as it should also complement our cardiorespiratory endurance exercise. And so I consider each of those to be kind of separate compartments of the exercise. And I prefer compartmentalization, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. And so there may be days or periods where I'm going to do a more low, moderate intensity, steady state type of cardio exercise, really looking just more for calorie burn, maybe trying to increase the distance that I can perform or the duration that I can perform a certain activity. High intensity interval resistance training, I might do those on occasion for kind of a supplemental workout to help burn more calories. Benefit that we haven't mentioned of a high intensity interval resistance training is that it tends to have a greater long-term burn for calories. It increases the metabolism. It's good evidence that it boosts calories. I think I've seen articles that have concluded that you may see an additional 15 kilocalories per hour expended for up to 24, I think even as far as like 48 hours beyond the bout of exercise. And so we might actually burn fewer calories during the duration of that exercise, but you're going to burn those calories for a longer period of time. And so if your goal is weight loss, fat loss, not weight loss, because we want to lose fat, not just necessarily muscle mass, you're going to burn more calories in the long haul. Whereas in low intensity, steady state, you end the exercise, you recover from that, your oxygen consumption is complete. You are not burning any further calories and you're done. So if you burn, again, the 100 kilocalorie rule, you go out and jog 2 miles, you're going to burn about 200 kilocalories performing that activity. If I can do a high intensity interval resistance training workout and I burn, say, 150 calories during that workout, I may actually burn an additional 100 calories over the course of the next day that actually boosts my metabolism much further. So there's benefits to all of these. I would consider all of them in your workouts. But remember, when we talk intensity, intensity is always relative. So you're not trying to keep up with the person next to you. You're trying to push yourself to the appropriate level so that you can get more fit and age well.
Well said.
Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.